Hi guys, I'm sitting at Haymarket on a hot day with a hot drink and a very hot report in my hand. This is brand new. This is the Cradle-to-Grave report. It's been produced through an alliance by MAG, which is a Motorcycle Action Group, Fairfuel UK, and ABD, which is the Alliance of British Drivers. And what this report is looking at is the comparison between internal combustion engine cars from cradle to grave directly compared with EVs, to see how that works out and whether or not it is justifiable for us to move entirely to EVs. This is fascinating stuff. In fact, some of it is literally quite explosive, and I'm not just talking about EVs there. But let's get into this. Settle down, get yourself a nice drink as well, a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, because this is going to take a while, and I'll go into it right after this. And right after this, actually, you'll see a comment from one of the authors of this report, Howard Cox, who's standing for the mayoral election here in London next year.
Hello, my name's Howard Cox. I'm the founder of the Fairfuel UK campaign, and I'm also standing as a London mayoral candidate for the Reform UK party. Very interesting times in this campaigning household. But what I want to talk to you about today is a new report that has been produced by the seasoned campaigners at the Alliance of British Driver and the Motorcycle Action Group with Fairfuel UK as to how clean electric vehicles are compared to petrol and diesel vehicles. We looked very objectively, researched very thoroughly, really from cradle to grave, and that means from first bit of lithium dug out of the rocks in the Congo, compared to the oil being taken out of the North Sea, all the way through to disposal of the batteries and the metal and the hardware, or everything of all the vehicles. In other words, right from beginning to the end of their life cycles. And what it shows is that diesel and petrol cars are much cleaner than electric vehicles over their life cycle. Food for thought, fuel for thought. We're being bombarded by a lot of rhetoric, a lot of propaganda from the government and various environmental groups that electric vehicles are the future. No, they're not. And if you remember the days of the first video recorders, there were two types. There was Betamax and VHS. Well, I equate electric vehicles to being Betamax. And those of you of a certain age, like I am, will remember that Betamax didn't take off. And that's what's going to happen with electric vehicles. And the only reason why they stand any chance of success in this country is because of massive tax subsidies and incentives from the government given to companies like Tata and the Land Rover, Range Rover Group, to actually build batteries in this country. £500 million has just been announced to be given to Tata to actually build their batteries over here in the UK. It just goes to show they can't stand on their own 2 or 4 tyres. They have to rely on subsidies.
So there you heard from Howard Cox of Fairfuel UK, who's also, like I said, standing for the mayoral election here in London on the 2nd of May next year. Now, this Cradle to Grave report is fairly substantial. You can get it from Fairfuel UK. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it quite carefully. I won't be able to go through everything because we'll be here for hours, but I'm going to pick up some key points of various things that they've covered, and maybe just touch on some of the other stuff where they go into a little bit more detail. Let's start with the summary. Our research has shown that from cradle to grave, battery-powered electric vehicles have little or indeed no CO2 advantage over internal combustion engine vehicles. How have they come to this conclusion? Well, we have considered the resourcing of raw materials used for the manufacture, utilization, and final disposal of both internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles, including emissions from the production of both electricity and fossil fuel. So not only have they looked at how these vehicles are made and then disposed of, but also what is actually supplying the power to these vehicles. If it was to show any theoretical advantage, a battery-powered electric vehicle would have to be manufactured and recharged using power that is solely as close to net zero as is currently scientifically achievable, including the CO2 costs of constructing the power generating infrastructure. This would restrict the only possible power source. Basically what they're saying here is that if that was the case, i.e. that even the power sources have to be net zero, then the only way you could actually do that is it would have to be from nuclear energy, because even wind, solar and hydroelectricity or hydropower stations are intermittent and need constant backup from conventional sources, conventional energy sources. So that alone is not enough. So really, you actually just need nuclear power stations is the only way that you can actually justify that. This is according to the report. And as yet, the world, and particularly the UK, is unable to deliver that scale of power reliability. There is no such thing as zero CO2, according to the report. Then they pick up more on the individual aspects of their findings. So this is going to be a little bit bitty here and there, and it's going to jump around a little bit, but it's all very pertinent and interesting stuff. I've gone through the report, so I picked up these things that I think are definitely worth talking about and worth mentioning. There's an issue that I've said over and over again. I've repeated in other videos, and I said recently that I used to say regularly that the cost of producing, the CO2 cost of producing an electric vehicle is considerably higher than producing a conventional vehicle. They say manufacturing a pure battery-powered vehicle creates more CO2 than an equivalent fossil fuel car, in some cases up to 74% more. That's according to Beryl Strategy Advisors. Additionally, they confirm that their research shows that manufacturing an average size battery-powered electric vehicle creates approximately 20 tons of CO2 compared to as little as 6 tons for a comparable conventional vehicle. It's normally about 5.6 tons for a regular car. So that proves the point that I've been making for a while now, that you have to really look at the cost of creating an EV and then how long that EV is in use. In fact, we're going to go into a lot of that, but these are fundamental aspects to consider. I want to just say, before I get more into this, is that I'm not fundamentally opposed to EV. I'm not anti-EV. I've tested them, I've reviewed them. I actually really like them. I think they actually drive really well, and I think that for certain people in some situations, they're probably the most practical transport solution there is. But I think what this report is doing is highlighting the need to be a little bit more open-minded about what the future transport solutions should be, and not basically put all our eggs in one basket, as appears to be currently the case with all of the advocates of the EV revolution, if you like. So as they say, battery-powered electric vehicles demonstrate little or no CO2 advantage over combustion engine vehicles, unless they are resource constructed, utilized and disposed of using the cleanest possible power sources. Now, their research shows the effective life of a battery-powered electric vehicle to be about half of an internal combustion engine-powered vehicle. And that's because of battery durability. And this is basically significant, because when you talk about electric vehicles and you talk about the fact, as we've just said, the high carbon footprint of producing and delivering those vehicles, and that's primarily due to all the stuff that's required to construct those vehicles and construct the batteries in particular, then you often talk about the fact that, well, you know, after a while they'll pay for themselves because they don't emit anything in use. However, the problem that we have, as they're pointing out, is, or they're saying, is that the usability, the usable life cycle of an EV is about half that of a regular car. Fossil fuel vehicles have an excellent record and are easier to recycle. This is another thing that they've touched on. They're talking about now recycling. So at the end of the life, what happens to these vehicles? And they say that, well, with a fossil fuel vehicle, as much as 95% of the vehicle's materials can be reused. The conventional elements of an electric EV, electric vehicle, so again, you know, the steering and the drivetrain and that sort of stuff. When I say drivetrain, I mean like the axles and stuff, because obviously the gearbox is not the same gearbox and stuff. But the gearbox elements, obviously, all the moving parts can be recycled just like they are in a regular fossil fuel car. The trouble that they have is the battery is exceptionally difficult to deconstruct. This means that the vast majority of spent batteries are sent to landfill sites, frequently in developing countries, that are least able to decontaminate and dismantle them properly. Reports say that battery technology has reached a level of maturity and that we now have diminishing returns. So this is another thing that a lot of people often talk about, and I've said it as well, to be honest. I've said the same thing, that as we've seen over the last couple of years, the battery technology in EVs has just got better and better, more and more efficient. The ranges have gone up, the charging times have gone down, and one presumes that if we stay on this trajectory, then that's just going to get better and better. What this report is saying is that that's not the case, is that we've actually already reached the level of peak level, if you like, of the technology of those batteries. I don't know about that. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, there's always new things to be discovered. There's always new ways of constructing things. There's always new formats. There's always ways of configuring stuff that can be improved. Anyway, this is what the report says. Nothing else in the periodic table can improve on lithium, even though solid-state batteries have promised improved power density. Occasionally we see publicity about alternative chemical formulation of batteries in the hope that better sources of power will be discovered. But a review has shown that, for example, sodium-based batteries are likely to be 3 times heavier and bulkier, rendering them unusable for transport purposes. The lifetime difference between the CO2 burden from an internal combustion engine and a battery-powered electric vehicle is often better for conventional vehicles for many of these reasons, as I've said. Again, going back to what happens to the battery once the vehicle has been used. Once an electric vehicle battery is worn out and replaced, so this is, for example, as has often been discussed, is that the battery degradation on an EV starts to get really substantial around the 10-year plus mark. And at some point, if you want to keep using that EV, you have to consider replacing the battery pack, because the amount that you can charge it up to, just like your phone, reduces substantially. As we know from other places, other sources, that the cost of doing that can be anything from $10,000 to $25,000 in order to do that. So economic argument aside, what they are saying in this report is that if you do that, then the vehicle's CO2 clock, as it were, restarts all over again, because you've put a new battery pack in there, and then of course all the CO2 footprint of creating that new battery pack applies all over again. And what they're saying is that this doesn't happen with an internal combustion engine, because most of the engines just keep going if they're well maintained. And normally they may need repairs, but if you need to repair them, you open up the block, you can remachine them, you can change the gaskets and all the rest of it. You can recondition those engines. Worst case scenario, you can have a replacement engine from another vehicle that you could put into an existing petrol vehicle, or even a diesel vehicle. Experience suggests that the CO2 created in making and using battery-powered vehicle is unlikely to be paid off in full over its lifetime. And because of its practical life is determined by the battery that has to be replaced at considerable financial cost, as we've already discussed. One study estimated that it would take 380,000 kilometers for a purely electric vehicle to break even compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle. Investigations show it is also a misconception to think that a battery-powered electric vehicle requires only as much as 1/3 of energy that is used by the best fuel economical internal combustion vehicles. So what they're saying here is that a lot of people say that, well, EVs are much more energy efficient, which they are, in terms of the amount of power coming from the battery to what goes out on the wheel. But what this report is looking at is the entire energy consumption of producing and running that vehicle. So what they've done is they've said, okay, well, if we look at the CO2 used to manufacture an electric vehicle divided by its likely lifetime, which is 150,000 kilometers. So what they're assuming is that we're not going to do the full as a normal combustion engine vehicle. Let's say 150,000 kilometers, let's say 10 years. This shows that the battery-powered vehicle generates 130 grams of CO2 per kilometer. The same calculation for a comparable internal combustion powered vehicle releases between 40 and 70 grams of manufacturing emissions per kilometer throughout its operational life, although this varies according to the manufacturing geographic location of the vehicle. Not 100% sure about that figure, because if you're looking at the total CO2 produced per kilometer, then obviously you have to look at the emissions. Most vehicles, most petrol engine vehicles, I have to say, are over 100 grams per kilometer. But anyway, having said that, it's an interesting comparison that they've actually worked out that an EV is responsible for 130 grams per kilometer over its potential lifetime. Internal combustion powered vehicles require fewer resources and have a lower carbon impact to build. Now, a lot of EV people are going to say, well, that's not true, because there's less moving parts in an EV, and an EV is a simpler construct, if you like, so therefore it's an easier thing to build. And to an extent, I agree with that. I think they are easier to make, especially when we're moving into the whole idea of modular platforms. This is why so many boutique car makers can move into this industry, because all they need is a platform, and they can build their own body on top of it and configure the car the way they want. It's less complex than creating or developing a brand new petrol or diesel car. However, this is what they've said. So on a cradle-to-grave basis, they say that internal combustion engine vehicle is far more sustainable to build and operate, and is therefore the most environmentally considerate option during its extended lifetime. In addition to that, what they're looking at next is the use of power, and of course the charging infrastructure, of course, which is becoming a big question mark when it comes to EVs. What they say is, unless the always on demand capacity of the national grid is expanded by tens of gigawatts, there won't be enough power to accommodate the proposed growth in battery-powered electric vehicle ownership if we want to maintain anything like the current level of freedom of movement. That's very interesting, that the current level of freedom of movement, because as we know, with things like ulez and 15-minute cities, LTNs, lower speed limits, and basically pay per mile or road charging that we know is coming, and various other things that they're trying to do to get people out of cars, then the reality is that when you look at if you want to maintain anything like the current level of freedom of movement, then I think that the cynic would say that, well, actually no, they're trying to reduce the current level of freedom of movement when it comes to personal transportation devices such as cars. But anyway, what they're saying is that if we have the current level of usage, as you can see behind me here, so many people using vehicles, even in this central London area, then we don't have enough power supply. That's what they're saying. The Cambridge University-led FIRE's report, Absolute Zero, indicated that by 2050, the grid would only have 60% of the capacity required if the current number of vehicles on the road were all electric. Only 60% of what is actually needed. The cost of expanding the generating capacity of the national grid to include local networks and charging points and everything else that's going to be put into place in order for all of us to have electric cars, and I'm just quoting from here, is astronomical. That's what the report says. Very conservative estimates back in 2019 considered the much quoted £3 trillion cost to expand the power supply and also obviously the charging network, but that's peanuts compared to actually creating power stations, right? And they said that £3 trillion is actually a significant underestimate, and that was in 2019. It's clear to us, according to the report, that the government estimates of the likely capital and on-cost of grid expansion and the cost of trade-in of all 35 million private vehicles. Actually, it's 40 million private. I suppose they're considering commercial vehicles, but there's 40 million vehicles in total in the UK. But 35 million private vehicles currently in use has not been publicized by the Treasury for unknown reasons. So they're suggesting here that they're keeping some data hidden from the public in terms of what is actually going to be the true cost of converting the entire nation to EV in terms of the power generation that needs to be done and the distribution of that power supply. The consequences of sufficiently expanding the national grid to supply the probable fleet of battery electric vehicles will have to be subsidized by inflated household electricity bills. So the implication here is that that's the reason they're keeping this a little bit on the QT, is because they don't want you to know that, considering that already we're in a cost of living crisis and already energy bills rocketed, they're going to rocket further because we're going to have to pay, all of us are going to have to subsidize the building of more power stations and a further charging network in order to subsidize electric vehicles. This is what the report is saying. This means that the electorate will be compelled to pay subsidies for products which only the most affluent will be able to afford, all this at the same time as being denied the use of internal combustion engine vehicles that will require. So basically what they're saying is that the electorate, the public, you and I, are going to be asked to subsidize this expansion for EVs, which are expensive, so only the most affluent can drive them, whereas our vehicles, internal combustion engine and diesel vehicles, we won't be able to drive them because they're taking them away from us. This is far-reaching. This is far-reaching. This is very forward-looking, this thing. The cost of dismantling the current fuel distribution system. So this is actually looking at the current distribution network that we've got for petrol and diesel. The cost of dismantling that, the loss of local employment must be taken into account. Many petrol stations will become a stranded asset, as they're unlikely to have the space to accommodate charging stations. And of course, the thing is, like with petrol cars or diesel cars, you'd nip in, take 5 minutes to fill it up, and you go off again. With electric cars, you have to sit there for anything between 30 minutes to 45 minutes plus, you know? And a formal estimate in the USA has calculated that to match the 2,000 cars that a typical filling station can service in 12 hours, an electric charging station requires 650 kilowatt chargers at an estimated cost of $24 million and an uninterrupted supply of 30 megawatts of power from the grid. Wow. Then they go back to the end-of-life scenario. The challenges of handling end-of-life batteries from electric vehicles means that the technology is not sufficiently developed to allow them to be marketed on environmental grounds alone. So what they're saying is that EVs, the whole argument is that they're better for the environment, And of course, there's already discussion about where those minerals and resources are coming from in order to build them. But what about what happens to them at the end of life? That's also not environmentally friendly. The Argonne National Laboratory at the US Department of Energy and Science and Engineering reported that a shredded electric vehicle battery can yield recyclable materials. So it can be recycled. So everybody that says no, they can be recycled, they're correct, they can be recycled. But it is cheaper for battery makers and vehicle manufacturers to just use newer ones. So what they're saying is that the cost of actually shredding it and taking it apart and then reusing it is much more expensive than actually just making a new one. That's not good. And as a result, batteries end up in landfill. In addition to that, even when it comes to recycling, what this report is saying, again, is that there's an absolute maximum of 3 cycles of these elements being recycled and reused. After that, the materials have to be disposed of in landfills as well. So they're saying that basically you can reuse them 3 times and then that's it. Wow. And remember the amount that we're going to be making in order to change the entire world's car park, vehicle park to electric. Making the recycling of batteries mandatory in the same way that recycling of internal combustion engine vehicles would place the cost of battery-powered vehicles further beyond the reach of the general public. So what they're saying here is that even though electric vehicles are already expensive, but if the government says, right, you have to incorporate the cost of recycling this, as is often the case with current vehicles, that's why we sometimes pay extra for them, because we have to pay for the end-of-life recycling of that vehicle. If you do that with electric vehicles, you will further make them even more expensive to purchase. Now, before the next bit, actually, because there was another chart here, which I'll probably put on the screen. This is very interesting, and it's this diagram here. What are EVs made of? So I'll put that on the screen, and it's very interesting because this basically breaks down an EV, and you show the amount of mineral content in an EV. You know, anything from 24 kilograms of manganese, 8.9 kilograms of lithium, 66 kilograms of graphite in an EV, and 207 in total kilograms of minerals, compared to 33.8, so 34 kilograms in total for conventional cars. Most of that is copper at 22 kilograms, and then manganese at 11.2 kilograms. And then they talk about these materials themselves, which is here. And again, I'll put that on screen for you. And this is basically where does that stuff come from? So copper, nickel, cobalt. Cobalt is interesting. Democratic Republic of Congo and China account for around 70% of production when it comes to cobalt. 90% of cobalt is produced as a byproduct of nickel and copper, and therefore new supply is based on mining of those stuff, right? Lithium, nickel and cobalt demand will grow from 10 to 20% to over 80% by 2030, and of course there are already discussions about the fact that there's going to be a substantial shortage because we have enough in the ground, but we just don't have enough mining going on to actually extract all these minerals that are needed. Lithium, the world could face shortages as early as 2025, according to this report. China accounts for 60% of global production and more than 80% of lithium hydroxide. Lithium mines that started operations between 2010 and 2019 took an average of 16 and a half years to develop. So that's how long it takes one of these to get up and running. Over 50% of lithium mines are located in areas that suffer water shortage. This could cause setbacks given the higher water requirements for these mining processes. So returning back to where I was in the report, the next bit talks about a thing that a lot of you have mentioned, which is the fire risk of EVs. I just want to add, this is not in the report, but just from my own side, again, to try and defend EVs a little bit, that EVs are actually much less prone to catching fire than normal cars. And there's some stats from America that prove that. They're a fraction they're a fraction of the likelihood of them catching fire compared to conventional petrol cars. In fact, hybrid cars, for some reason, are more likely to catch fire. But even but not by a significant amount. The trouble is that when EVs do catch fire, they're spectacular because the runway burning effect that you have with the battery packs, and the fact that they're very, very hard to put out is almost impossible. In fact, I think now the fire brigades have created these massive containers that they're able to put the entire vehicle in, shut them, seal them tight, so they basically starve them of oxygen to try and do that. The trouble is that the components in these battery packs can generate their own oxygen, so this is what also then further exacerbates the situation and keeps the fire burning, or gives it a likelihood of reigniting again. Anyway, so what they've said in this report The potential fire risk of vehicles powered by lithium batteries has been vividly demonstrated, as we were discussing, and it's possible that seaborne transport has been placed at considerable risk. And we have seen instances a few years ago, I think, one of the cargo ships that caught fire. The danger of one-way battery fires is in confined spaces such as the Channel Tunnel, Transalpine tunnels and underground car parks has yet to be thoroughly investigated. So they're saying that more research needs to be done. And they're citing the case of the Chevrolet Bolt a few years ago. Bolt is a very popular small EV in America, where the manufacturer issued a recall because there was a fire risk with those cars. And in the recall, they actually said that the cars should not be parked within 50 meters of other cars. And of course, currently, just recently, I put it in one of my recent videos, that there was a recommendation that came out here to companies that repair and work on these cars, on EVs that is, to keep them 15 meters apart from everything else. I don't know how these people are going to do that, but that was the requirement. In the report, our research shows that battery-powered heavy-duty vehicles are wholly impractical and exceedingly unlikely to be a viable proposition in the foreseeable future. So this section of the report actually goes into the commercial vehicle sector. So I'm going to skip over this bit, but if you want to find out more, again, you can get the report off Fairfield UK. But basically, the rest of these few paragraphs, they're proving the fact that it's not viable because of the heavy payload of commercial vehicles and the fact that battery power is not enough to sustain them over longer distances. In fact, what they said here, I'll just conclude with a bit here, experience in both the USA and Germany with battery-powered buses has led to the withdrawal of the fleets due to the limited ranges that were achieved. Net zero and the relentless goal of pursuing the electrification of everything is scientifically lacking. In fact, it's pointless, the report says. Net zero is unaffordable, technologically regressive, it's overloaded with risk, is economically unjustifiable when no objective cost-benefit analysis has been either established or published by the government, and the technology is far from meeting the environmental benefits that are claimed. This is what they're getting very serious at this bit now. So what are the recommendations? So they have some recommendations. Again, I'm going to not go through all of them, but I'll just pick on a few of them. The first one that they put on here under recommendations, we recommend that the proposed ban on the sale of the internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030 is immediately shelved indefinitely. So this is the ban that comes in 2030 in the UK, which bans the sale of new petrol and diesel cars in the UK. The similar ban in Europe is 2035, but that's already likely to be unachievable because, as I mentioned before, Germany and Italy have thrown a spanner in the works and said that they're not going to abide by that. I personally think it's unachievable here as well, but the report says that it just shouldn't happen. It should just be shelved. So let me just repeat that again. We recommend that the proposed ban on the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030 is immediately shelved indefinitely, and in the meantime, a variety of competing technologies should develop far more cost-effective and affordable products than battery-powered transport. And I think that that's a valid point, and something that I've said as well is that we should definitely look at EVs. This is me talking now. We should definitely look at electric vehicles. We should definitely look at developing that technology, making it more accessible to people. But we should not be blinkered to the extent that we're ignoring other possibilities. That's alternative fuels, alternative forms of motive power, and alternative forms of powering that motive power. So lots of other things that could be explored, and by focusing on one thing, by putting all our eggs in one basket, I think that we're missing other opportunities here. I think that's what they're getting at as well. This will allow the best available technology to emerge to help improve road transport that will not require the wholesale disruption of our national logistics, which would unfortunately be the case if the proposals for electrification go ahead. There needs to be an urgent, realistic assessment of the electrical capacity required to support an entirely electrified UK vehicle fleet. It is essential for long-term planning purposes that future electric power requirements should be established, funded, and managed cohesively. So what they're saying is that we should be realistic about the fact that whether or not we have a charging infrastructure or whether or not we can actually supply enough power to that charging infrastructure. We believe that all subsidies to both new and existing renewable energy sources should be discontinued as soon as reasonably and legally practicable. If the technology behind total electrification is so good, then surely the further taxpayer-funded profit protection schemes are not required. If the technology can meet the demands of society in availability and sustainability and price, then it must be allowed to stand alone unaided. This is also a very interesting point, and it's all about the idea of us being force-fed electric vehicles through legislation and basically subsidizing the technology and the building of these cars, the development of these cars, whereas in fact, with any good solution if the solution works. So when cars first came along, people didn't have to be forced to change from horses to cars. They just did it naturally because they looked at cars and said it's just better. At the time, it was cleaner, it was more efficient, it was easier to get around. Didn't fall sick, didn't die, so it was just better because people naturally moved to it. And I guess what they're saying here is the same thing. It's like if the new technology is that good, people will automatically move to it, and we don't need to subsidize it. However, what we are doing is subsidizing it. This next bit is very interesting, which is never had occurred to me at all. There should also be an investigation into how the 6,000 essential everyday products that are derived from the petrochemical industry can be replaced. So what they're saying is that if you're going to shut down the petrochemical industry, which you're effectively going to do if you're going to take away ICE vehicles, because there'll be no further investment in that arena, what about all the other products? Everything from plastics to liquids to chemicals to all kinds of stuff that we require petrochemical industry for. What's going to happen to all of those products? Again, going back to the report, we conclude that the best possible case for battery-powered electric vehicles is still not good enough for the country's needs. We recommend that proposals for the compulsory electrification of the entire UK fleet requirements by 2030 lack sufficient resources, planning and grid capacity, and that they will end in a deliberate act of national self-harm. Wow, that is strong, that is powerful. It will distort the UK's long-term economic viability and will significantly damage our trading position in global markets. So what they're saying here is that by relentlessly pursuing this aim of the 2030 deadline, we're going to fundamentally damage, possibly beyond repair, the economy of the UK. We conclude that the best possible case for battery electric vehicles is still not good enough in comparison with internal combustion engine vehicles. So what they're saying is that the argument just doesn't wash, the case just isn't there. The electorate, that's us, that's you and me, cannot be expected to continue paying regressive subsidies to uneconomic renewable technologies that are unable to survive unaided. So basically, they're saying that we're having to pay for all these technologies that can't actually stand on their own four wheels as such, as Howard said earlier. Some form of financial encouragement should be granted to extend the lifetime of internal combustion engine vehicles. So contrary to scrappage schemes, which I'm fundamentally opposed to myself, this is me speaking now, I hate scrappage schemes. I always say that there's such a wastage of perfectly good usable vehicles that have got plenty of life left in them, and this is confirmed in this report. They're also saying the same thing, is that actually there should be financial encouragement and incentive to keep these vehicles on the road and keep them going, because actually that's best for the environment, because of course they have paid their CO2 dues, haven't they? We have demonstrated that an extended life internal combustion engine power vehicle is the most eco-friendly option. So financial incentives to prolong their life cycle are entirely appropriate and economically offer an unrivaled option. So again, this is traditional engine cars. If we are wrong, and the technology behind net zero and the ambition to replace fossil fuels is so good, then the government should stop subsidizing it at the taxpayer's expense, because it should be able to stand on its own four wheels or on its own two legs, if you like. If the technology can really meet the demands of society in availability, sustainability and price, it can stand alone without market distorting cash handouts to either the more affluent or corporate fleet owners that cannot be justified. So again, just reiterating that point. So then there you are. There is the report. Like I said, you can get yourself a copy and go through it yourself in more detail. But I think that it's a very significant report. It's pretty important, and I think that there's a lot in there to talk about and to discuss. You may not agree with all of it. I don't think I agree with all of it, because I still think that there is a case for EVs. I think that there's definitely a case for having them exist alongside conventional transport, and I think there's definitely a case for the benefit of EVs in urban environments like here. I think they make a lot of sense, particularly from the point of view of public health rather than the environment. I actually think that EVs are better for public health than they are for the environment, and I think that this report also confirms that. But at the same time, I've also always said that the best car for the environment is an old car, and this report actually proves that. I'd love to hear your comments, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Brown car guy.
Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please hit the like button and share this video as well if you can. And while you're at it, check out these guys who also sponsor my content. I am deeply grateful to them because it helps me to buy new equipment, put fuel in the cars, and yes, buy a cup of coffee. You can do the same. Just go here or right here on YouTube. Just hit these three little dots down here and click on thanks. Make sure you're signed in first. My content is free, but this is how you can help me keep it that way. I may even send you a gift. Oh, by the way, watch this next.